What happens when a bus driver's son walks into the most elite school in the state and humiliates a professor in front of her own students? She gave him an equation so complex it wasn't even meant to be solved. It was meant to break him. But what she didn't know was that this boy carried a genius she had tried to erase from history. This is not just a story about math. It's a story about standing tall when the world tells you to sit down. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. It's the fuel that keeps us writing more stories that matter. Now, let me tell you what really happened. Why are you standing again? Sit down like a normal student. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the classroom like glass against pavement. Marco stood at the back, spine rigid, fists clenched, face unreadable. Around him, 30 students turned their heads, curious, judgmental, entertained. But what none of them knew was that sitting had become an agony Marco could no longer afford. Because 3 months ago, it was this very woman, Dr. Evelyn Hawthorne, the school's most revered math professor, who had shattered not just Marco's pride, but his body, with a single strike of her ruler. That day, Marco had made the mistake of correcting a tiny error on the board, a simple sign misplacement. He'd said it gently, respectfully, but it didn't matter. She turned, blue eyes cold like steel, and without a word slammed the wooden edge across his lower back. It was quick and silent, but it left more than a bruise. It left Marco with a pain that now made every chair feel like a torture device. Today, that pain flared again. Yet Marco didn't flinch. "I'm fine standing, Dr. Hawthorne," he replied, his voice like smoke after a fire, quiet but still burning. The elite classroom of Langdon Preparatory Academy, where the children of senators, CEOs, and Ivy League alumni learned their Latin and calculus, fell silent. Because Marco, he wasn't supposed to be here. He was a scholarship student, a charity case, the bus driver's son. He wasn't meant to speak up, he was meant to obey, and more than anything, he was meant to know his place. That's what Evelyn Hawthorne believed. And today she would remind him. As the class scribbled notes about quadratic equations, Marco's mind drifted to that morning, 5:15 a.m., still dark, still cold. His father, Thomas, had made their usual breakfast, burnt toast, powdered eggs, and the same advice he gave every single day. Keep your head down, study hard, don't give them a reason to notice you. And Marco had nodded, like always, swallowing his frustration like medicine. But today, that was becoming impossible. Because when Dr. Hawthorne suddenly stopped mid-lecture, looked straight at him, and said, "Mr. Williams, since you clearly prefer to stand, why don't you come solve something challenging?" Marco knew exactly what this was. Not a test, a trap. The board cleared. A new equation appeared, massive, terrifying, and utterly out of place for 10th grade math. It wasn't algebra, it wasn't calculus. It was a non-linear differential equation so complex it belonged in a graduate-level seminar. Whispers rippled through the class. Amber Langley, whose father was a Supreme Court judge, giggled. "This should be fun," she whispered. And Hawthorne smiled, a slow, venomous curve of her lips. She stepped aside. "Let's see what the bus driver's son is capable of." Marco felt his fingers twitch. He glanced at the chalk, then at the board. Something cracked inside him. Not in fear, but in defiance. His mother, the woman they never spoke about anymore, had once told him, "Math is music, baby. If you hear it right, you'll never be lost." She had passed when he was 7, but her journals, her equations, her ghost, still taught him every night. Marco stepped forward. 30 pairs of eyes followed his every move. And Evelyn. She was ready to watch him drown. But she had no idea. Marco already knew how to swim. Marco picked up the chalk. It was colder than he expected. Or maybe it was just his hands. The equation loomed over him, dense, complex, cruel. Exactly what she wanted. It had boundary conditions, multiple variables, and a structure that even seasoned college students would sweat over. This wasn't a pop quiz. This was execution. "Begin," said Dr. Hawthorne, arms crossed like a general at a firing squad. But Marco didn't look at her. He looked at the numbers, and suddenly, something in his chest shifted. Because he recognized it. Not the full equation, no. This variation was new. But its bones, its shape, the underlying dance. It was familiar. His mother's journals, her handwriting, her loops and symbols, her obsessions with partial differential equations that could model airflow and thermal waves and who knows what. She had shown him something almost exactly like this in a notebook titled Volterra Experiments, 2006. Marco was just 10 when he first attempted it. He'd failed. But now was different. He exhaled and wrote. The room shifted. The giggles stopped. His hand moved fast, but not rushed. He broke the equation down step by step, isolating terms, identifying structure. Within 90 seconds, he had applied a substitution method most had never heard of. By minute 2, Amber Langley had stopped chewing her gum. By minute 3, the classroom had gone utterly still. Dr. Hawthorne's brow furrowed. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. She had expected panic, tears, embarrassment. What she got instead was calculus poetry. Marco erased a section, rewrote with a cleaner solution path, and introduced a transformation that made even Jared Klein, the AP valedictorian candidate, sit forward in his seat. "Is that a Laplace technique?" someone whispered. Marco didn't hear it. He was somewhere else now, somewhere deep, somewhere safe. He remembered his mother's voice as she bent over his workbook. "Never fear a blank space, my love. It's just waiting to be understood." 5 minutes passed, then 7, then 10. And when Marco finally stepped back, the board was full, dense but pristine. At the bottom, beneath a long stream of transformations and integrals, he had written, "Solution converges for both constant and variable coefficients. General case confirmed." He put the chalk down, turned around, and saw complete silence. No one moved, no one breathed. Dr. Hawthorne stared at the board, then at him, then back again. There it was, her trap, her show of superiority, turned inside out. She'd tried to humiliate a bus driver's son. Instead, she had just introduced her elite classroom to something they had never seen before. Genius. And worse, for her, it was undeniable. "Where did you learn that?" she asked, her voice lower, tighter. Marco hesitated, then replied softly, "From my mom's journals. She was a mathematician, before she got sick." He didn't say more, but the room heard everything. The final bell rang, but no one moved. They were still frozen in the aftershock of what they had just witnessed. Marco quietly returned to his desk, still standing as doctor. Hawthorne erased the board with movements that lacked their usual precision. She paused at Marco's final line, the generalization, the part that expanded the solution beyond what was required. That part she left untouched, because she didn't understand it. Marco knew. So did Jared, so did Amber, even if she wouldn't admit it. This wasn't just a correct solution. It was an innovation. And it came not from a student at the top of the class, not from a senator's daughter or a venture capitalist's son, but from Marco Williams, the kid who always stood, the one everyone ignored, the bus driver's son. After school, Marco didn't walk straight home. He waited by the fence next to the faculty parking lot, pretending to text, as he watched her storm into the faculty lounge. Inside, he knew what she'd do. She'd rewrite history. She'd twist what happened. She'd call it a fluke. A lucky guess. She couldn't afford to let him, someone like him, have a real moment. Langdon Academy had an image to maintain, and people like Marco, they were meant to stay in the background. That night, Marco sat at the kitchen table with his dad, Thomas. Dinner was quiet. Canned soup and 2 slices of toast. Same as usual, until Marco slid a piece of paper across the table. His father looked down. It was a flyer. Langdon's annual mathematics invitational. Prize, $5,000 scholarship endorsement from the head of department summer recommendation to the Stanford Advanced Youth Scholars Program. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You thinking about this? Marco nodded. It's invitation only. Hawthorne's in charge of selecting who gets in. His father was quiet. Then he asked, like he always did when something big was brewing, You sure about this? Marco stared at his soup. I didn't want to, but something changed today. He hesitated. She tried to break me in front of everyone. But when I looked at that board, all I saw was Mom. It felt like she was there, like she wanted me to fight back. Thomas didn't speak for a while, then quietly, She'd want you to burn that place down. With numbers. Marco chuckled, a small exhausted sound. That's the plan. What neither of them knew was this. Dr. Hawthorne had already started building a wall, behind closed doors. She was calling the competition committee, pulling strings, saying things like, he's emotionally unstable, he lacks proper training, he plagiarized, and worse. She was digging into his mother's past, because in Evelyn Hawthorne's world, talent wasn't enough, and bloodlines mattered. She had spent her life guarding the gate to elite mathematics, and today someone had walked through the door without her permission. 2 days passed. Marco returned to class with his usual silence, but something had changed. People watched him now. The boy who once blended into the background now stood at the center of whispers. Even the legacy kids had started asking questions. How did he do it? Who was he? Was it luck? A cheat? Or was he actually brilliant? And that attention? It made Evelyn Hawthorne furious. She was losing control of the narrative, of the room, of the system she'd spent decades building. On Thursday morning, Marco found a note tucked into his locker. Withdraw your name from the competition before it's withdrawn for you. No name, no signature, just threat. He crumpled it up, threw it away, and went to class. That day, Evelyn had invited a guest speaker, Dr. Clarence Woodridge from Yale, a celebrated mathematician, and an old friend of hers. As the class buzzed with curiosity, she introduced him like royalty. And now, she smiled tightly, Dr. Woodridge will speak about the future of mathematics. Please, take notes. This may be on your college applications. Marco stood silently in the back until the guest began discussing hyperbolic differentials and misapplied a key condition. It wasn't huge. It wouldn't fail a college test. But it was wrong. Marco felt a familiar ache in his spine, not from his back, but from the weight of choice. Correct him? Again. He looked at Dr. Hawthorne, who watched him like a hawk. Daring him. He remembered his father's voice. Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is not to speak, but son, if you've got the truth, say it, even if your voice shakes. Marco raised his hand. Excuse me, sir, but I think the function you're referencing breaks down under those boundary conditions. The room froze. Even Dr. Woodridge blinked. I'm sorry. Marco stepped forward. voice steady. You're assuming smooth convergence near zero, but your variable substitution causes a discontinuity there. And then he walked to the board, picked up a marker, and proved it. Again. Silence. Then, "Brilliant," the Yale professor murmured. He looked to Evelyn, clearly impressed. "Is he part of the Langdon Invitational?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. She forced a smile. "We're still reviewing applicants." That afternoon, Marco was called to the principal's office. When he arrived, Dr. Hawthorne was already there. "Marco," said Principal Dalton, folding his hands, "there's concern regarding your demeanor in class." "My demeanor?" Marco asked, confused. Dr. Hawthorne leaned forward. "There are whispers that your recent behavior has been disruptive, intimidating to other students." "Because I solved an equation." "No, because you are undermining authority," she snapped. Principal Dalton sighed. "Marco, we're simply suggesting maybe the invitational isn't the right path for you. It's very high pressure. It might reflect better on you to focus on coursework instead." Marco realized what was happening. They wanted him out. Not because he wasn't capable, but because he didn't belong in their story. That night, Marco stood outside the bus depot where his father was finishing his shift. Thomas saw his son's face and didn't ask. He just handed him a warm sandwich. "Talk when you're ready." Marco stared at the street, at the city, at the future he was trying to reach, and finally said, "They're trying to push me out." Quietly, politely, but it's still a push. His father put a hand on his shoulder. "You know what people like that fear most, son." Marco shook his head. "Someone who isn't afraid of them. Someone who doesn't need their approval to be great." The next morning, Marco walked to the front office and signed the sheet. Official entry: Langdon Mathematics Invitational, Marco J. Williams. Let them come. He was done hiding. Monday morning, the final list of competitors was posted. Marco's name was at the bottom, but it was there. Students crowded the bulletin board, pointing, whispering. And when they saw his name, the questions exploded. "Wait, he's in? Isn't he the bus kid? Didn't Hawthorne try to get him disqualified?" Marco stood off to the side. Quiet, watchful. He didn't need to answer, because his presence said everything. He wasn't just entering the competition, he was declaring war on the expectations placed upon him, and everyone knew it. Inside the faculty lounge, Dr. Hawthorne slammed the newspaper against the table. "He's in. They overrode me." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from rage. Across from her, the assistant principal glanced away. The board had to listen, Evelyn. After what he did last week? Even Yale's Dr. Woodridge called in to say the boy's gifted. Gifted, she spat. He's a wild card, an undisciplined anomaly, that equation. He couldn't possibly understand the depth of what he wrote. But he did, the assistant said softly. And worse, he taught it better than you. She went silent. Because that cut. She hadn't just lost control. She had been outshined. And not by a rival professor, by a child. A child whose last name wasn't in any Ivy League registry, whose father drove buses, whose mother's research, once rejected by her own academic circle, was now echoing from the mouth of her son. That night, Marco stayed up late. His room was filled with papers, notebooks, equations sketched across the wall in black marker. In the center of it all sat one battered leather journal, his mother's, the one he only opened on special nights, when he needed to feel her again. Tonight, he read every page, every proof, every scribbled correction, every quiet moment of brilliance. And then He turned to the very back, where she had once written, "If you're reading this, my sweet Marco, it means you've found the courage to step into the light. Never forget, math is a language of truth, and the truth is always worth fighting for." His fingers trembled, but his heart? It had never been steadier. The day of the competition arrived. Langdon's auditorium gleamed with perfection. Velvet curtains, polished floors, camera crews, elite guests from top universities. It wasn't just a contest, it was a performance. Every parent with money had shown up in designer suits. Every judge had been prepped. Every student was expected to represent legacy. And in the back row, Marco stood alone, wearing a pressed shirt his father had ironed at 5:30 that morning. Not tailored, not expensive, but clean and ready. One by one, the students took the stage. Amber Langley, Jared Klein, Sophia Lancaster, Hawthorne's niece. Each presented their solutions with confidence, polished and rehearsed. The audience applauded politely. Then came the final name. Marco Williams. A hush fell. He walked slowly, steadily, the lights blinding, but he didn't blink, because this was his battlefield now. He didn't have flashcards or a slideshow. He had a whiteboard and an impossible equation. Evelyn Hawthorne sat in the front row, arms crossed, jaw tight. She had handpicked this final problem. It was abstract, cold, designed to confuse. But Marco just smiled, because he recognized it again. Another variant of his mother's work, this one twisted and buried beneath layers of academic ego. And he didn't just solve it. He disassembled it, then rebuilt it. Better. He paused, turned to the audience. "This assumes fixed conditions," he said softly, voice calm but cutting. "But if we treat the variables as living systems, like people, like bias, like the world we actually live in, then suddenly the whole model shifts. It doesn't just solve, it adapts." Silence, then gasps. And for the second time in 3 weeks, Marco Williams left a room speechless. The silence didn't last long. It was shattered by the first thunderous clap, then another and another, until the entire auditorium, students, parents, judges, rose to their feet in a standing ovation so loud it seemed to shake the stage. Marco stood still, hands at his sides, chest heaving slightly, but his eyes calm, certain. He had done what no one expected, what no one had allowed. He'd taken their impossible and turned it into his moment. Not by fighting the system with fists, but with something far more dangerous: truth. Dr. Evelyn Hawthorne didn't clap. She couldn't. Her hands trembled, pressed tightly into her lap. Her face was stone, but behind her eyes raged a storm. Because this wasn't just defeat, it was a reversal of everything she believed in. Pedigree, control, legacy, and now the whispers were beginning, from fellow faculty, from donors, from her own students. Isn't that her student? Didn't she try to block him from entering? Wait, wasn't that his mother's equation? Didn't she reject that research? The very foundation she stood on was starting to crack. Backstage, Marco was met by the judges. Every single one. A professor from MIT, a visiting scholar from Oxford, a talent scout from Stanford, and, at the center, a man with white hair and a kind smile, Dr. Stephen Ames, director of the Princeton Mathematics Fellowship Program. He extended his hand. "Marco Williams," he said, voice warm. "You don't just understand mathematics, you feel it. That's rare, that's extraordinary." Marco shook his hand, his own still chalk-dusted. "Thank you, sir." "We've reviewed your board solution," Dr. Ames continued, "and I'll be frank, We've never seen a high school student apply variable coefficient restructuring to a nonlinear system like that, especially mid-demonstration. It just made sense, Marco replied quietly. Dr. Ames smiled. Genius often does, to those who carry it. He handed Marco an envelope. This is an official invitation to join our Princeton Summer Scholars Program, fully funded. And should you choose to apply next year, this is your early endorsement. Marco's breath caught in his chest. He took the envelope, fingers shaking. Meanwhile, across the auditorium, Principal Dalton approached Dr. Hawthorne. "Evelyn," he began, his tone controlled, "we need to talk." She didn't respond, just stared at the whiteboard Marco had filled. The final line still there, the one she didn't understand. "He embarrassed the system," she muttered, almost to herself. "Not just me, all of us." "No," Dalton said. "He revealed it." Back at home, Thomas Williams waited outside their apartment door. Marco appeared with the envelope in one hand and tears in his eyes. His father stood slowly. "Son," he whispered. Marco looked at him and smiled. "She was right, Dad." Thomas didn't need to ask who. He just pulled his boy into his arms and held him there, strong and proud and silent. No words needed, because every inch of this moment belonged to her. But this story wasn't over yet, because on Monday morning the school board called an emergency meeting, and for the first time in 15 years, Dr. Evelyn Hawthorne was the one under scrutiny. Monday, 7:45 a.m., Langdon Academy's boardroom. The curtains were drawn, the air heavy. At the long oak table sat 7 members of the school board. At the far end, Principal Dalton. Beside him, Dr. Evelyn Hawthorne. Her posture, perfect. Her blouse, immaculate. Her expression, fractured. In front of her sat a folder marked Disciplinary Review, Staff Misconduct Allegations. Inside, statements, testimonies, evidence from students who had been dismissed, belittled, silenced, and most damning of all, medical documentation of Marco Williams' back injury. "Corporal punishment has been banned in this district for decades," one board member said coldly. "It was a misunderstanding," Hawthorne snapped, her voice clipped. But the board was no longer nodding. They were listening, critically. And then came the final blow. A letter from Dr. Ames of Princeton commending Marco's brilliance, calling him a once-in-a-generation mathematical mind, and questioning why a student of such caliber had not been previously recognized by the department. The implication was clear. The failure wasn't Marco's. It was hers. At lunch that day, the announcement came, over the loudspeakers. Dr. Evelyn Hawthorne has officially resigned from her position as head of mathematics at Langdon Academy, effective immediately. The halls went silent. Some gasped, some whispered, but Marco? He just sat at his usual cafeteria table, his tray untouched, staring at his hands, because winning felt complicated. She had tried to destroy him. Yes, but she had also built her whole identity on the belief that only certain people could be brilliant, people not like him. And now, that belief had been shattered. By one simple thing: truth. Later that evening, he received a text from an unknown number. "I read her journals. Your mother was far ahead of her time, and so are you. I'm sorry." Marco stared at it for a long moment. He didn't reply, not out of hatred, but because some equations don't need to be solved. That week, something changed at Langdon. Students who once mocked Marco now greeted him in the halls. Teachers began referencing his whiteboard solution as a case study. Younger students whispered his name like a myth. And Jamal, his best friend, grinned every time. "You broke the system, man." "No," Marco said, voice soft. I just reminded it what it forgot. That brilliance doesn't ask for permission. And truth never needed a pedigree. Weeks passed. Spring turned into summer, and Langdon Academy felt different. The math department now had Miss Alvarez at the helm, a young, brilliant Latina educator who believed intelligence came from effort, not bloodlines. She invited Marco to co-host a peer tutoring program. Twice a week, students filled a spare classroom, some confused, some curious, all inspired. Marco stood at the whiteboard now by choice, not as punishment. And every time he explained a problem, he thought of two people, his father and his mother. One afternoon, as he was erasing the board, a freshman girl approached. "Hey, are you really the kid who solved the equation Dr. Hawthorne gave?" Marco smiled gently. "I guess so. Can you help me? I don't get math at all." "You don't get it yet," he said, "but you will." And as he sat down beside her, guiding her through the first line of an equation, something inside him shifted. This was the real victory. That weekend, Marco packed for Princeton. The summer program was prestigious, intensive, and terrifying. But he wasn't scared, not anymore. Because when you've stood up to a system designed to ignore you and still won, what could a lecture hall possibly take from you? His father drove him to the station, the silence between them comfortable. As the train pulled in, Thomas turned to his son. "You've always been my hero, Marco." Marco looked at him. This man who worked double shifts, wore the same boots for years, who sacrificed without complaint. "You're mine," he said. In his dorm room that night, Marco unpacked one final item, his mother's journal. Inside, tucked between 2 pages, was a photo he hadn't seen before. A young Catherine Williams standing in front of a chalkboard. On it, an early sketch of the same equation Marco had solved. Below it, in faded ink, she had written, "Someday, someone will see the beauty in this, even if it's not me." Marco closed the journal slowly, eyes wet. "Someone did, Mom," he whispered. "Someone did." At Princeton, his professors didn't ask where he came from. They asked how he thought. And as Marco dove deeper into mathematics, research, and discovery, he realized something profound. The most elegant equation he would ever solve was himself. Behind every quiet kid, behind every name no one pronounces correctly, behind every student society chooses to overlook, there might be a genius waiting for just one chance to be seen. Marco didn't win because he was the smartest. He won because he refused to believe he was less. His story is a reminder. Talent has no zip code, no last name, no dress code, just courage and a whiteboard. If this story moved you, please like the video, drop a comment with your city or country, and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Because who knows, the next story we tell might be yours.